The months heading to the release of the Silent Hill 2 remake were hard on me because, on one hand, I do quite enjoy the games that Bloober Team have made in the past. Even if they mostly end up being misguided, it always felt like they gave their maximum. Every subsequent game feels like they're pushing their limits even further, so I always believed that it was only a matter of time before they made something universally acclaimed by the mainstream media. If you want more on the subject, I actually made 2 retrospectives on their games, starting with Layers of Fear and The Observer, so do check them out if you like this video. On the other hand, I was sweating buckets because the leap between the medium and Silent Hill 2 is a colossal one. They've only just dabbled in implementing the third-person perspective to varying degrees of success. They've never done a third-person shooter. Their puzzles were never really puzzles and more like temporary setbacks to change the pacing of the game. The stories that they attempt to tell are often more interesting conceptually than their execution is. Basically, I do love and respect them, but I think that they still have a lot to learn before they could work on something this important. Plus, when you factor in the blasphemy that was Silent Hill Ascension and the misguided premise of Silent Hill The Short Message, which I've already covered in my channel by the way, it's easy to see how Konami would want to force Bloober Team into making something totally out of touch. Well, I'm happy to announce that nothing would have prepared me for this kind of success. I want to emphasize right from the start that what Bloober Team achieved is nothing but extraordinary. They succeeded in making one of the legends by stripping it down to its core and seeing where they could take risks and push in new directions. That resulted in them fleshing out the town by adding a bunch of shops to explore. The fog also has its own personality with its ever-changing intensity, turning an old console imitation to something that feels like an omnipresent entity wanting to hinder the player's progress. Combat also feels familiar but challenging, creating a uniquely feeling system that sits somewhere between the combat of the old and the one that was brought forward by the Resident Evil franchise. Overall, I think that they've succeeded in doing what Konami's been trying to do since they announced their comeback. As positive reviews keep pouring in, it will bring back interest into the almost forgotten brand, greenlighting more games while also encouraging those less interested into giving it a try. However, and this is where the issues start for me, I don't think that this remake is as good if you're in love with the original. For context, I've been worshipping the 2001 version for the last 10 years at least. I finished it so many times that at one point, my fastest speedrun without using any cheats or exploits was an hour and 18 minutes. As long as you remember where all the items are, you'll be able to avoid all unnecessary detours and completing puzzles in a fraction of the required time. On top of all that, I also bought the vinyl soundtrack and I've bought most statues that were released around the time where this game was announced. Even if Konami released so many horrible titles afterwards and pushed the license into a coma, my flame for it never got extinguished, which is why my position in regards to the remake is... well, it's complicated to say the least, which is why I decided to make this video. I want to explain why, in my opinion, the many liberties that modernize the license are also the same reasons that destroy the general feel and pacing of the game. It also destroys its sense of exploration by locking off its map into multiple contained areas that, in turn, removes that sense of discovery in favor of forcing you into its reimagined combat system. That's why, in my restless dreams, I do see that town, and regardless of my melancholy, I can't deny that it's a bittersweet return to a world that feels all so close to home. It's hard to put into words how I felt when the first cutscene appeared on screen. James is rendered with such high fidelity that it almost feels like watching a live-action rendition of the character. It actually hits even harder for me because I just played through the enhanced version on PC and thought that rendition of him was really good. Obviously, this is 2024 graphics at its finest, so right as I'm contemplating at how grateful I was to be alive, James steps out of the public bathroom and sees the parking lot and... I just couldn't contain myself any longer. I giggled at how masterfully the team replicated the iconic scene. It gave me chills in the same way that the original did, which is something that the game does often in fact. The road that ensues has also been updated, making it more realistic while retaining that sense of mystery and uncanny nature. Same feeling persists when I get near the cemetery and get awestruck at how they beautifully render the church overseeing the tombs. Seeing it slowly pierce through the fog as we get near it gives it a majestic futuristic feel that's only betrayed by its dilapidated landscape. As you can see, I was genuinely enthralled by Bloober Team's dedication to the original's aesthetic. They really nailed the gloomy feel that gets amplified by the environment fading in and out of existence. All of this is then combined and multiplied as you enter town, and again, I can't explain just how mesmerizing it felt to walk down its familiar streets and get hit by a combination of senses of nostalgia and discovery. Never in my life have I wanted as much to just roam aimlessly through a bunch of desolated streets until I booted up this game. Objects big and small appear magically around you as you move around, making it seem like the world is moving around you and not you around it. At times, it feels like you're walking through someone else's restless dream, and that's something that I've never felt before. Actually, now that I think about it, I think this is actually quite accurate, because a lot of the changes that work for me feel like someone desperately trying to remember what the original was while filling in the gaps when necessary. For example, when you reach the town in the original, you rapidly find a trail of blood splattered on the main road. You follow it, leading you to an underpass where the static of a radio catches your attention. The lying figure, as it's called, appears next to you, forcing you to pick up whatever's nearby, which in this case is a long pipe. You then get the opportunity to test the combat controls while moving on to the street that contains the key for the apartments. In the remake, however, the trail doesn't lead you to an underpass, but into someone else's backyard. Noises are heard at a distance, so you keep following it until you get a glimpse of the monster as he disappears further down the path. You then have to crawl through an opening in the garage door and nudge yourself through a wall located at the far end of the room. The chase ensues until we finally find the same radio on the nearby couch. As we're examining it, the monster bursts into the room, and right as your back is against the wall, you find a wooden board nailed to the nearby window. You pick it up and then get to experience the updated combat system. Fun fact, in the original game, the first monster that attacks you can't actually damage you. If you stand there and wait, you'll see that it wasn't programmed with that ability, meaning that its sole purpose is to die for the sake of you learning the combat mechanics. I was therefore curious to see if Bloober Team implemented the same gimmick, but much to my surprise, well, they didn't, so yeah. This is just one of the many instances where I think that Bloober Team's rendition is actually better than the original. It feels more realistic and is subsequently more interesting than walking on a random path, which is inconveniently barricaded but has both items we need to survive. Speaking of exploring the neighborhood, I never had realized just how locked off and minimalistic the city rendition was until I played the remake. To me, the lack of interactable buildings was the manifestation of the town, forcing the player to only visit locations relevant to his rehabilitation. Bloober Team, however, disagreed, and therefore made a bunch of stores and apartments accessible for the player. There's a botanic store that's covered with dead plants and is totally optional. There's also a cool vinyl store that's infested with lion figures, and a pharmacy that charges way too much for its medication. Even the famous room for the original makes a comeback, but in a new and drastic way. It now contains a jukebox that's tied to your main story progression. Needless to say, the town of Silent Hill feels more real than ever before, and overall, I think that they succeeded in making it more interesting as a whole. However, innovation always comes with a price. Even if I applaud them for taking risks and pushing the envelope for what could be done, I don't think that they fully understood the original when making some of them, and that ended up having bigger repercussions over the whole game than they probably entailed. As cool as it was for the previous room now has a bigger role in the narrative, it subsequently also ended up removing a lot of the mystery and intrigue that surrounded it. To be more precise, that room was entirely optional in the original, as you could just stumble onto the key for the apartments by chance, missing the breadcrumb trail whose purpose was to lead you to it. Plus, as most buildings aren't interactable, I was genuinely surprised when I randomly interacted with a door and discovered the room by chance. Then, once inside, you discover an abandoned room that seemingly has no purpose. It has no interesting characteristics to it other than the mystery surrounding the text and its fourth wall breaking nature. It was this clash that led to a lot of speculations and debates because it was so random and yet so purposeful that you couldn't stop wondering why that room is there. Now, because they turned the room into a random lobby with a jukebox, it seems a lot less interesting and mysterious. I mean, it makes a lot of sense that someone would want to patch the windows acting as the facade for a lobby. It therefore seems less random, and by decorating the room as they did and making it unmissable, it removes a lot of that charm that was present in the original. In other words, it's like they made an Easter egg part of the design. The charm of an Easter egg is that, well, It's an Easter egg. It's visible, and knowing the reference and how to find it is what makes it fun. However, if you go corporate and make it part of the team like it did in this case, it just seems less magical and unique. The same sentiment also is representative of the puzzles. I played the game on normal in every category as it's the default option of the game, and I found that most, if not all of them, lacked the randomness and surprise that came from the original. When you're exploring the apartment complex, for example, there's a moment in both games where you're asked to throw something heavy into the trash chute, unclogging it and making accessible the coin needed for a puzzle. Turns out that, in both cases, you need to find a 6-pack of canned juice to do the job. In the original, the cans are located randomly in front of a door, so you have absolutely no idea what its use is. I remember taking forever just to figure out what its intended use was. It also didn't help that you're throwing it right above an obstructed area. I mean, in real life, you wouldn't really consider it until you desperately try every option and figure out that it was the solution all along. In the remake, however, you find the box right next to the garbage chute, meaning that you won't have time to reflect on why the game gave it to you. You'll instinctively try it out and realize that it worked. Plus, you're throwing it from the 3rd floor this time, so it makes a lot more sense that it would work on an obstruction still located on the 2nd floor. If we ignore the lack of reflection and mystery surrounding this puzzle, it's undeniable that its execution is a lot less interesting than the original because the surprise factor is non-existent. Add into the mix the better graphics that make it seem heavier than it did in the original, and I wouldn't be surprised if you told me that you barely remember this puzzle in the remake, or that you didn't even know it was a puzzle to begin with. Another moment where the devs removed the original's charm is in the hospital. If you played the original, you most probably remember how puzzled you felt when James randomly decided to collect someone's hairstrings. Plus, the build-up just to get it is so big that I vividly remember the mindfuck as if it was yesterday. Well, in the remake, they changed it for some tubing and removed the build-up, which, again, makes more sense, but is therefore less memorable. If I had to sum it up, the problem this causes is that the game lacks a lot of the charm, which came from how nonsensical and random it felt at times. The coin box is now located in the main lobby, meaning that you're no longer wondering why the hell is James picking up all these coins along the way. In real life, you just ignore them, misjudging their use until you have that epiphany later on. In the remake, however, it clearly states what you need ahead of time, which in turn changes the feel of exploration. You're no longer trying to piece a puzzle together as much as you're going room to room, filling up a mental checklist. Yes, I do have to admit that they made the puzzle more interesting by making a coin flippable this time, meaning that you sometimes need to picture behind it to continue, not to mention that it now has 3 stages instead of just the one like in the original. However, the flip side is that the riddle on screen is so easy that you won't have to think about it twice, unlike in the original where normal mode was actually really hard. This level of streamlining also gets worse because not only did they simplify the puzzles and the items that compose them, the devs also changed the way that you explore all key areas. Every location, no matter if it's the apartment complex, the hospital, the prison, and so forth, are separated into bite-sized sections, usually being an amalgamation of a few rooms incarcerated by a bunch of locked doors. The plus side is that this ensures that the player never gets lost, as he knows that those newly accessible rooms will always contain the next item or key required to unlock the next restricted area. However, this also creates a paradox because, on one hand, it doesn't feel like the game is holding your hand. Once you discover the key item hidden in the room, you immediately know where you have to go next, which removes any frustration that normally comes from these types of games. It therefore succeeds in making you feel as if you're the one pushing the narrative forward, which is awesome. Great job there. On the other hand though, when the whole game is made this way and you triple this length, it rapidly feels like you're a guinea pig going through Bloober Team's maze. You get to the end of the path, pick up the highlighted item, which is always located in the farthest room from the starting point, only to then run back and unlock the next part of the maze. In that sense, the game ends up feeling like you're constantly being escorted to the finish line more than in any other Silent Hill game before it. In the 13 hours that it took me to finish my first playthrough, I only got lost twice, and in both cases, they were because of my lack of attention and not because I didn't figure out what I had to do with a specific puzzle. That to me sounds crazy because Silent Hill used to be all about getting lost and piecing the map's layout in your mind. It's about making links to to things that you've seen or heard of, only to then get that dose of dopamine when you realize that you've actually figured it out. The first time that I finished the original game, it took me about 18 hours to reach the end credit scene. On my 5th playthrough though, I was able to cut that time to 1 hour and 18 minutes because I had learned where each item was and what was the optimal path to get them. The original game is only as long as it takes you to discover everything and piece them all together. It's also for those reasons that when I played the Enhanced Edition, it only took me 4.5 hours to get to the end, as the game had become something familiar to muscle memory than something gated by the game's pacing. That kind of playthrough is unfortunately no longer possible, not just because of everything that I mentioned so far, but also because of the reason those changes were implemented in the game in the first place. In case you weren't aware, Silent Hill was originally intended to be Konami's competitor to Resident Evil. The reason it ended up not being the case was because Team Silent succeeded in convincing the higher-ups to let them make what they had envisioned. When the first game was released, it succeeded in forging a path and creating a new gameplay loop, one that was centered around exploration and less about combat and managing resources, all while being under constant stress. However, after 11 years since the last official entry and Resident Evil fully defining the survival horror genre, Bloober Team felt like they had no other option but to follow in Capcom's footsteps if they wanted to stand a chance in the market. Luckily for us though, they knew that making a carbon copy of its competitor wouldn't work for the franchise. Resident Evil has always been more fast-paced and combat-orientated, so the challenge therefore was to make a game that felt familiar but retained that unresponsiveness from the 2001 release. James, as you probably know, wasn't trained in combat. He's just another regular Joe, so going all guns blazing wouldn't actually make any sense for the story. Therefore, Bloober Team decided that the best approach would be to create a hybrid. Gone are the tank controls and in comes the third-person shooting that we're used to seeing in the Resident Evil. Pressing the right trigger alone activates their melee attacks, which translates to James either hitting the enemy with his melee weapon or finishing them off with a stomp when on the ground. Holding the left trigger activates the aiming mechanism of whatever gun that she had pre-selected, with the right trigger now used for firing it. Also, the longer you aim, the more accurate your shot will be, so taking your time to aim down the sight helps ensure that you don't have to use more bullets than what you really have to. However, even if the game gives you 3 different guns that each have their own ammo, the reality is that ammo is scarce, so you'll only use them when the situation becomes dire. Therefore, you'll be more inclined to, more often than not, close the distance and take part in what I like to call the aerobics of combat. Basically, by making James easier to control and more reliable when it comes to actually dealing damage, Bloober Team opted to compensate by making the enemies more limber, faster than you, and ultimately more aggressive. Take the lion figure from before. His main attack is to spray acid in your general direction, forcing you to sidestep around the room. Then, as his attack creates an opening, you'll start smashing him with your weapon only for it to tank through your attacks and riposte, attempting to cover you with acid once more. If you ever get too close, he will actually grapple you, removing a full bar of your health and force you to rapidly spam the interact button to let go. Then, if it ever ends up on the ground and you don't finish him off, it will start rapidly crawling all over the place while jumping towards you when you get near it. That alone is more challenging than it sounds, but there are actually 3 aspects that make finding them a real hassle. The first one is that James has barely any resistance to almost any direct hits, resulting in him losing a huge amount of health every time. Unlike in the original, where his health is represented by the health thermometer, in the remake, they opted for a hybrid system where the screen gets redder while the menu becomes harder to see. It's a pretty cool mechanic, and it's one that feels simultaneously like an homage to the first one, while also feeling like a modernized version. The problem is that James only has 3 health states, and one direct hit can often remove a full health state. The first one is lost when the screen becomes red. The second is seen when the health symbol appears at the bottom right of the screen, and the third one results in your death. This therefore means that every action you take yields immediate results. One false step will result in you taking too much damage and having to reap the consequences. The second reason completes the first one quite well, which is that most of the game is spent in narrow corridors or rooms. It means that you'll often get hit because there's barely any space to maneuver, and enemies can also body block you if you get unlucky. Finally, and most importantly, enemies are rarely alone. If they aren't grouped with their kin, they're often clinging next to the most annoying enemy types in the game, those being the mannequins. These enemies prove to be the most challenging, not because of their combat complexity, but by the way that they act around the player. Their first instinct is to hide behind a pillar or a wall, waiting for you to get near before it strikes you on sight. That means that, in most cases, you'll often be walking to a specific point on the map only to find a lion figure blocking your path. You'll therefore start attacking it only to then get jumped by a mannequin, which proceeds to take the spotlight as the other one takes the opportunity to retreat and cover you with acid. That's also the moment where you'll decide to reload your save because healing items are rarer than ammo, and it doesn't take much for you to start sipping throat syrup like it's your morning orange juice. Nurses are actually even worse as they can block your attacks, hit you in quick succession, and are overall more resistant than all other enemies in the game. It's therefore your job to make split-second decisions and determine when it's better for you to attack, change weapons, or retreat. In its best moments, it creates this very tense atmosphere where you're in pitch black darkness with only your flashlight barely illuminating the way forward. Then, you turn the corner and see an enemy, but as every monster emits a unique sound, you also know that there's a mannequin hidden somewhere nearby. It's therefore up to you to decide if running to it, saving ammo, and risking an ambush makes sense, or using bullets to get its attention is the best way to go. At its worst though, it becomes very repetitive as the strategy will always be the same. You'll learn with time how the AI works for each enemy type, so you'll be able to predict where each enemy is at most moments and act accordingly. Plus, with the game being exponentially longer than the original, the devs really needed to add way more enemy types than what was already there. At some point, you find out that there is nothing else, so it does become boring when you get to the end. The reason it's more of a problem here than the original was because engaging in combat wasn't really a thing. I've had runs where I only killed the mandatory bosses and skipped the last two with the dog ending. This was doable because your flashlight attracts enemies, so keeping it closed makes them way slower to react, giving you enough time to circle around them and move on with your day. In the remake, however, that mechanism was completely removed, forcing you to always have an aggressive playstyle. You're therefore pushed to engage with them, which makes you acknowledge their existence while adding to the runtime. Also, even if you put the brightness level to a maximum, your presence alone is enough to aggro them and drive you to react accordingly. All combined, it's very easy to understand why the game was designed in the way that it was. Streamlining the puzzles and the exploration ensures that the player can concentrate on combat and the threat that it brings to your run, as a lot of work went into making sure that the enemy AI felt challenging, always felt like they had the upper hand, and always made you feel like any false move resulted in their gain. It's for those reasons I think that most players will be happy with this game, as it's a direction that's more inclined with the current gaming market. It's challenging, brutal, it's captivating, and it's hard in the fairest way possible. But it's unfortunately not what Silent Hill is at its core. Maybe I'm wrong and I'm the only one that sees it this way, but the first 4 Silent Hill games used its enemies as side puzzles while you were trying to figure out the main one in your head. As James was hard to control and that combat itself didn't feel satisfying to take part in, finding ways to avoid it felt rewarding on its own, forcing you to develop strategies to slither around them. Then, in key moments in the story, you are forced to switch gears, push your limits, and outmaneuver the boss as you riddle it with bullets. The emphasis was on the story and how every puzzle symbolized or directly added to the intrigue that surrounded the narrative. However, in the case of the remake, it feels like the opposite and that the focus shifted to the combat system. Its goal is to keep you on your toes and get you ready for the main spectacle, which are the redesigned bosses. In doing so, you're indeed pleasing a lot more people by making it feel more closer to Resident Evil, but for those that stay true to the original, it kind of feels like a bastardization. However, to give credit where credit is due, that doesn't mean that Bloober Team gave up on its story. Even if playing the game couldn't be further from the original, the presentation and general execution of the story feels like the much needed update that it required, making it, paradoxically, the ultimate way to experience it. Hey, some quick update real quick. Because this video took a lot longer to make than I first anticipated, I was able to drop my playthrough from 14 hours to less than 6, and get an additional 5 endings on that same playthrough. The reason that was possible is because, number one, you unlock the chainsaw almost immediately after starting New Game Plus, and here in the remake, it one-shot kills all enemies, and even bosses are stun locked and forced through their phases like almost immediately. The second reason is because if you follow a guide, as you can easily find, on the internet, you'll know what item you need subsequently to get, so that you can essentially maximize your run, and then at the end just reload your save and, get all of them back to back. So the reason I'm mentioning it here is because now that I've finished it for a second time, and I've played the game in the way that I prefer to play it, which is by speedrunning it, I can guarantee you that everything that I mentioned so far is still valid, and it also cheapens the experience even further, because now you get an item that removes like the best part of the game. You know, if your whole game is centered around combat and now you just remove combat, it's impossible for you to not concentrate on the pacing, where the items are, and what is the most optimal way to grab everything so you can get out of there as fast as possible. The thing that I realized when I was essentially speedrunning the remake was just how much I preferred the original, because the original had smaller maps, and the further you got into the game, the smaller they are, meaning that you feel like you're doing a lot more in less time. Although here, even if like I was able to cut off like a huge portion of my time, it genuinely felt like twice the amount, because like it felt like I was on a huge journey trying to, you know, get through all the items as fast as possible. So like I do want to reiterate that like I do genuinely love what Bloober Team have done here, and I think that what they've done is absolutely amazing. It's just that like for me, they've essentially changed the experience to the point that like I don't even want to play the game anymore. Like I think I'm missing like 9 achievements currently, like one more playthrough and I'll be able to get everything that I need, and I just don't feel like doing it, which is super rare for me. Like I've finished the original so many times, and yet here, like 2 playthroughs, I'm done. So like everything, please take my opinion with a grain of salt. Like just, you know, just make your own. Like fuck, buy the game, you know, have fun, and let me know what you think in the comments. But one thing that is for sure though, is that what's following next in my video, which talks about the story and the general execution of it, is genuinely amazing. And I do think that even if you're like me and you don't really appreciate the rest, playing the story just to see what they did here is worth the asking price alone. So please enjoy the rest, and thank you very much for watching to this point. I hope you at least found it interesting. If there's a single area that, without a shadow of a doubt, the remake surpasses the original in flying colors, it would definitely be the way that it retells the iconic story. Most of it is kept intact from the original, meaning that all key moments still hit the same way. However, what differentiates it from the predecessor are the little but significant ways that Bloober Team either added to the dialogue or opted to completely change its presentation while preserving the essence of the scene. For example, in the original, it's kind of a stroke of luck that James ends up on the pier and finds Maria waiting for him. He just finds a random key that unlocks the front door to an apartment complex, and it just so happens that exiting it brings him to the park that he needed to visit for some reason. The player basically fills in the gaps, but it's never something that's concretely confirmed in the game, or if it is, I completely missed it. However, in the remake, it obviously ends up playing differently. After fixing a vinyl and inserting it into the jukebox that I mentioned earlier, you get to hear a portion of the famous "What Lurks in the Forest" melody. That then makes James reminisce of a time where he had visited the park with its late wife, setting up his motivation and subsequently the next gameplay sequence. It's only fitting then that, like James, we expect to find Mary there, only for expectations to get subverted into a more profound way. This is just one of the few instances where the devs decided to add a scene for the sake of supporting the narrative, and even if it's just a few seconds long, it helps conceptualize a portion of the game that honestly didn't really need it, but it is a welcome addition nonetheless. Most of the time, however, the devs will show restraint by keeping the general execution of a cutscene while updating it for modern standards. Take the first dialogue exchange found in the game. Starting with the original, here's the unedited cutscene of James meeting Angela for the first time in the cemetery.
Excuse me,
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I didn't mean to scare you. I'm kind of lost.
Lost?
Yeah, I'm looking for Silent Hill. Is this the right way?
Yeah. It's hard to see with this fog, but there's only the one road. You can't miss it.
Thanks.
But
Yes?
I think you'd better stay away. This town, there's something wrong with it. It's kind of hard to explain, but...
Is it dangerous?
Maybe. And it's not just the fog either.
Okay, I got it. I'll be careful.
I'm not lying.
No, I believe you. It's just... I guess I really don't care if it's dangerous or not. I'm going to town either way.
But why?
I'm looking for someone.
Who is it?
Someone very important to me. I'd do anything if I could be with her again.
Me too. I'm looking for my mama. I mean my mother. It's been so long since I've seen her. I thought my father and brother were here, but I can't find them either. I'm sorry. It's not your problem.
I hope you find them.
Yeah, you too.
Now that's done, here's the remake's rendition of the same scene.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry. I was just...
Hey, it's okay. I didn't mean to scare you. I'm kind of lost.
Lost?
Yeah, I'm looking for Silent Hill. Is this the right way?
Yeah. It's hard to see with this fog, but there's only the one road. You can't miss it.
Thanks.
But... I think you should stay away. This town, there's something wrong with it. And it's not just the fog either.
Is it dangerous?
Maybe. It's kind of hard to explain, but
I'll be careful.
I'm not lying.
No, I believe you. It's just... I guess I don't really care if it's dangerous or not. I'm going either way.
But why?
I'm looking for... someone. Someone very important to me.
Me too. I'm looking for my mama. I mean, my mother. It's been so long since I've seen her. I thought my father and brother were here, but I can't find them either. I'm sorry, it's not your problem.
No, I hope you find them.
Yeah, you too.
As you can see, it's slightly longer than the original, but man is it more impactful and intriguing. Long gone is the stiff and somewhat dreamy dialogue exchange that the series is known for. Now, it's a fully new cast with modern standards in voice acting. All lines, no matter the character, are delivered in a more believable and immersive way that, interestingly enough, doesn't remove from the randomness and the mystical nature of its presentation. I, for the longest time, thought that the stiff and somewhat opioid-infused presentation worked for the story, and that removing it would also remove some of that identity that helped make the original iconic. Well, this is one of the instances where the devs proved me wrong. Yes, I do think that it loses some of its charm, but seeing James emotionally tear himself apart does more for the cause than all of the previous scenes combined. Well, that is when he's not hungry, of course, because God knows that you can't be emotionally invested when you have an empty stomach, right? I mean, I honestly can't believe that they chose that skin as the reward for spending on the deluxe edition. It makes the game worse in every possible way that I kind of have to congratulate them on it. I don't think that anything would have made the game worse than something that covers all the work that they spent on making the story more relatable to the player. By the way, for your information, the reason I bought the deluxe edition was for the 48-hour access. It does make a difference when everyone else gets an early review code and I somehow have to make the best video that I can, hoping to grab the end of the hype train before it's too late. Anyways, YouTube struggles aside, one major thing that surprised me was that on top of the devs knowing exactly how far they can modify the source material, they also never forgot the reason that they ended up working on the remake. They took every chance that they got to make an homage to its source material. When walking towards the entrance leading to the underpass, for example, you'll get a sudden music cue, hinting at a key moment that happened in the original. In that sense, it shows that the devs, even if they ended up changing so much of the game, never forgot the journey that led to them returning the honor and making this video game. For me, it's kind of a double-edged knife because on one hand, hand, I'm constantly reminded of a game that I've never fully moved on from. As I'm playing through this one, I often end up disappointed as it's not made the way that made me idolize the original for a good portion of my life. This feels like a totally new game that shares the same title, and then by saying that, I kind of realized the obvious, which is that I've never really left my personal Silent Hill. I never really moved on from it, never really stopped wandering those desolate streets, never really learned my lesson, which is why seeing them here kind of pisses me off, to be honest. But at the same time, it didn't take too long for me to realize that it's okay that I feel this way. The remake is so good, in fact, that it will become someone's entry point into the survival horror genre. It has the power to captivate people's imagination to the point that, like me, they'll end up feeling the town's presence every time they find themselves surrounded by fog. It will become someone's favorite horror game, and I sincerely believe that we're all better for it. In that sense, when I let go of what I want this game to be and examine it for what it is, I can say that I finally feel a sense of pride in what was done here. It's hard for me to say this, but I don't think that them doing it any other way would have brought the people together as much as it did here, especially because the market has moved on. Even if obviously I haven't, but that's kind of the point here. Anyways, I hope that this review made sense because I found it quite hard to put my feelings into words. I wish that I had more time so that I could finish it multiple times and get all the endings. I wish that I had the luxury to let it ferment in my mind before having to make my final opinion and release a review. However, that's just wishful thinking, so as a final goodbye to the remake, I want to finish my review with a quote from the director that made the original game. When he was asked to share his opinion on the remake, he had a lot of praise for it, including the following phrases which sums up my thoughts quite well. It's been 23 years. Even if you don't know the original, you can just enjoy the remake as it is. Whether it's good or bad doesn't affect the original. And that, my friends, is wisdom at its finest, which brings us to the end of the video. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone. Do like and subscribe, the normal stuff, and do leave a comment if you like this video or if you have something to add. If you've played the remake, I would genuinely like to know what your thoughts are, especially when compared to my opinion, which seems to be controversial when compared to the rest online. Thank you for watching. It really means a lot to me that you did, and thank you for making this gamer's dream a reality. I do really enjoy making these videos for you, and I do really enjoy hearing from you. Have a nice day, everyone, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.